Hello, friends. Today we will explore Zizek's magnum opus, Less Than Nothing, Hegel and the Shadow of Dialectical Materialism. To grasp the theoretical weight of this text, we must first discard the pervasive textbook caricature of Hegel. For over a century, continental and analytical traditions have constructed a straw man Hegel, the philosopher of absolute teleology, the voracious totalizer whose dialectic acts as a cosmic pacifier, consuming all historical difference, contingency, and otherness into a celebratory, harmonious higher unity. Zizek's central thesis reverses this narrative entirely. For Zizek, Hegel is not the thinker of a closing triumphalist totality, but rather the ultimate philosopher of the crack, the gap, and the inherent blocking of reality itself. The core philosophical project of Less Than Nothing is not a simple historical return to Hegelian idealism, but a radical repetition of Hegel. Following Deleuze and Lacan, Zizek distinguishes between a false repetition, which merely replicates past formulas while clinging to an outdated order, and a true repetition which returns to the historical turning point to unearth the radical potential that was missed, repressed, and misconstrued by subsequent history. The missed potential Zizek seeks to recover is a unique iteration of dialectical materialism. By passing Hegelian dialectics through the crucible of Lacanian psychoanalysis, he constructs a transcendental materialist theory of subjectivity. The 21st century does not require us to move beyond Hegel, rather, the historical, scientific, and political deadlocks of our contemporary world demonstrate that the time of Hegel is only just arriving. To understand Zizekian ontology, we must look at Hegel's famous maxim from the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit. The absolute must be understood not only as substance but equally as subject. In pre Kantian metaphysics and naive realism, reality is conceived as an objective substance, a self sufficient, fully constituted, positive block of being out there waiting to be discovered. Kant's critical turn disrupted this by demonstrating that our knowledge of reality is always mediated by the transcendental categories of our mind. We can only ever know the phenomena, the world as it appears to us, while the noumenon, the thing itself, remains radically inaccessible. Standard readings of Hegel argue that he resolved Kant's dualism by widely claiming that the subject's mind creates or encompasses all objective substance, collapsing the world into absolute subjective idealism. Zizek proposes a drastically different materialist reading. Hegel's true breakthrough was not asserting that the subject can fully master substance, but rather the limitation of the subject is simultaneously the limitation of substance itself. Our inability to fully know the absolute or to close the epistemological gap between our minds and the external world is not an epistemological failure on our part. It is an ontological feature of reality. Reality is, in its very beginning, incomplete, cracked, and self divided. The subject is nothing other than the name for this structural crack or void within the fabric of substance. To think the absolute as subject means recognizing that the universe itself is fundamentally open, unaligned, and non all. This brings us to the titular concept of the book, Less Than Nothing. Zizek borrows Democritus's ancient atomist formula. Then a neologism for thing is no more real than medon, nothing. Zizek takes this a step further. Before there is nothing, there is a pre-ontological X, a structural glitch, or distortion that is less than nothing. To formalize this ontology, Zizek maps Hegelian dialectics onto triadic structure of Lacanian psychoanalysis: the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. In Lacan, the subject is not an ego or a substantial psychic entity. It is a void, a gap produced by the castration of entry into the symbolic order of language. When we enter language, we are alienated from the fullness of immediate biological being. However, this loss does not leave us with a simple vacuum. Instead, the loss itself generates a reminder, a ghostly surplus object that embodies the very gap of our desire, the object petita, the object cause of desire. Zizek utilizes this Lacanian apparatus to reinterpret the Hegelian dialectical process. We begin with immediate unity, the illusion of a fully constituted natural reality. This is followed by alienation and negation, the splitting of this reality through language, thought, and abstraction. Finally, we reach the negation of the negation, that is, the realization that there is no lost unity to return to. The loss itself is primary. In standard dialectics, the negation of the negation is understood as a synthesis that heals the wound. For Zizek, the negation of the negation means realizing that the wound heals itself by recognizing that the wound is all there is. The object petita is precisely the materialization of this Hegelian negation of the negation. It is the paradox of an object that is nothing but the shape of a missing piece, an empty pocket of space that exerts a massive gravitational pull on our psychic reality. This leads to Zizek's distinction between desire and drive. While desire endlessly chases our missing objects, believing they will bring ultimate fulfillment, the drive circulates around the failure itself, finding a perverse repetitive satisfaction in the very frustration and blocking of its goal. A substantial portion of the book is dedicated to navigating contemporary philosophical battlegrounds, specifically intervening in the debates surrounding Quentin Meillassoux and speculative realism. Meillassoux famously launched a critique against correlationism, the post-Kantian philosophical consensus asserting that we cannot think of humans without the world, nor the world without humans. Seeking to break out of this anthropocentric circle, Meillassoux and various new realists advocate for a return to a reality independent of human subjectivity, utilizing mathematical set theory to access the great outdoors of absolute contingency. Zizek mounts a brilliant counterintuitive defense of the Hegelian subject against these new realisms. He charges that Meillassoux' absolute contingency relies on a masculine logic of the exception, where a totality of contingent laws is anchored by one absolute necessity, the necessity of contingency itself. Zizek counters with the feminine logic of the not all. The speculative realists commit a naive error. In trying to eject the subject to get to the true objective reality, they forget that the subject is not an external spectator distorting the real world. The subject is an immanent obstacle through which reality splits and manifests. The symbolic order does not merely performatively add meaning to a collection of meaningless rocks out there, it transcendentally constitutes reality in its very being. To eliminate the subject is to eliminate the primary site of reality's own ontological self-division. Zizek's materialism is not a reductionist materialism of matter and mechanics, but a transcendental materialism of the void. Perhaps the most fascinating and rigorous theoretical move in Less Than Nothing occurs in its penultimate chapter, where Zizek establishes a structural homology between Hegelian dialectics, Lacanian psychoanalysis, and the ontology of quantum physics. Zizek rejects the popular New Age misappropriations of quantum mechanics that claim human consciousness creates reality. Instead, he uses quantum physics to prove his core materialist claim. the nature itself is ontologically incomplete. He isolates four key features where quantum physics matches dialectical ontology. First, there is the efficacy of the virtual. In the symbolic order, the mere potential or threat of an event alters real behavior. Similarly, in quantum mechanics, the probability wave function contains virtual paths that mathematically determine the actual trajectory of a particle. The virtual is ontologically real and effective. Second, there is knowledge in the real. At the subatomic level, a particle behaves as a wave until it is observed, at which point the wave function collapses into a concrete particle. The electron behaves as if it knows it is being watched. Zizek interprets this not as a subjective idealism but as a proof that reality requires a structural registration to fully become what it is. Third, there is the collapse of the wave function as a symbolic registration. An event is only fully constituted once it is registered by an external system or instrument. This mirrors how a raw sensory experience only gains real traumatic or ideological weight once it is pinned down by a master signifier within language. Fourth, there is retroactivity. In quantum delayed choice experiments, the act of observing a particle is a present retroactively determines the path it took in the past. This perfectly mirrors the Hegelian-Lacanian concept of the historical and psychic retroactivity. History is not a linear chain of causes, rather a new event such as the dawn of Christianity or a political revolution, completely rewriting the past, transforming contingent random prior events into a necessary, coherent teleological prologue. What are the socio-political and theological consequences of this anthology of the gap? In theology, Zizek develops a radically subversive reading of Christianity. The true core of Christianity is not the promise of a transcendent afterlife or a benevolent, omnipotent God overseeing creation, rather, the crucifying moment, Christ's cry on the cross, "Father, why has you forsaken me?" is the moment of the death of God. In that precise instant, God the Father experiences his own radical abandonment and limitation. For Zizek, Christ's death signifies that there is no big other in the heavens guaranteeing the meaning of existence. What survives the death of Christ is the Holy Spirit, which Zizek reinterprets as the egalitarian community of believers who realize they are entirely on their own. Christian atheism is the ultimate liberation because it forces humanity to assume absolute responsibility for the historical process. Politically, Less Than Nothing addresses the structural deadlocks of global capitalism. Capitalism is structured like the Lacanian drive. It is a system that thrives on its own crisis, an economic machine powered by the constant reproduction of its own internal failures and excesses. Zizek reflects heavily on Hegel's concept of the rabble from the philosophy of right. Hegel recognized that modern civil society naturally produces a class of systematically marginalized, impoverished people who are excluded from the social totality but remain structurally necessary for its continuation. The rabble represents a political less than nothing, a part of society that has no proper place within the system but embodies its fundamental structural truth. Zizek concludes that our current historical moment demands a political suspension of the ethical. We cannot rely on standard liberal democratic frameworks or reformist ethics to fix a global capitalist system whose foundational ontology is built upon exploitation and ideological fantasy. True emancipatory politics requires an act of radical courage, stepping into the void left by the absence of the big other, embracing the ontological incompleteness of our situation and daring to act before all conditions for a guaranteed success are met.